Thank you very much, Aisha. And thank you to SALT and ITU for this invitation and the chance to be here in this amazing city. And Aisha was saying earlier that there are some friends you have who you don't see for years, and when you meet again you feel as if no time has passed at all. And I'm quite convinced I was here only a couple of weeks ago, but no, it was 10 years ago. What I'm going to do this evening, and thanks to SALT and ITU, I've given 3 talks. And I guess before I go into that, I should also say the other thing that I think you're about at SALT is getting people to talk to each other and maybe fertilize other things that might happen. And certainly being face-to-face means that we've already realized there are all sorts of things that we could do and we should be doing in linking our networks together. The 3 talks I've given are about my 3 main areas of interest, and I'll just flash through them. But I'm coming back to this. This is what I'm talking about this evening. It's Procuring Innovative Architecture. But my long-term passion is spatial intelligence. This is a human capability that we all have. It's evolved over millennia, and it is something, however, which colors the way we see the world. Our histories in space do that. And as architects, we should be very much aware of that. And I think, as you know, Zeynep Menon kidnapped me from your program and took me to Ankara, and I was able to give a talk there to the students about spatial intelligence, which was one part of what I'm fascinated by. And then yesterday at ITU, I was talking about this program that I initiated over 25 years ago, which is inviting architects with a distinguished body of work established over at least 7 to 10 years after graduation to actually look at what they've achieved and understand what they've mastered, and then surface evidence about that mastery that we can use to understand what happens in designing, what people actually do when they design. And also that helps other practitioners, but it also helps students to actually look at what they're doing. So I was talking about that at ITU yesterday. What I want to talk about today is the whole notion of procuring innovative architecture. And this began for me when, by sheer accident, I managed to get control of my university's commissioning process for selecting architects. This doesn't happen very often, as I think you'll know. I mean, mostly vice-chancellors and deputy vice-chancellors keep their professors of architecture well at bay when it comes to selecting architects. But the university commissioned, behind its 1970s polytechnic blocks, it commissioned an infill theatre. And they showed it to me, and I said, this will be a disaster. And they said, oh no, it won't. And they built it, and I sat in the front row, and the Vice-Chancellor launched it, and everybody sat there looking at it, and then they turned to me, and with one voice they said, this is a disaster. And I said, what can we do? And I'd been given that some thought. I was new to the city, and I thought, and in fact, many people, when I went there from London and the Architectural Association, thought that what I would be doing is importing my friends from London to do all of the architecture. But I thought, no, that's not what interests me. What interests me is the local culture of architecture in this city. And I want to find a way of promoting that. And fortunately for me, the university had just turned 100 years old and had a series of committees saying, well, what do we do during the next 100 years? And one of the main things by a committee run by the then Lord Mayor, a woman called Winsome McCackey, was to say, well, when you built these buildings, you turned your back on the city. In fact, they turned their back on everything. And this is the main civic street of the city. It runs down past the town hall, past the State Opera, past the State Gallery, past, it is the chief thoroughfare of the civic city. And that building faces away from it. And in fact, it doubly faces away from it. It is, to get into it, you have to go half a story down or half a story up. And the committee that she chaired said, look, the mission of this university is to be at the forefront of technical research and education. And to do that, you have to open yourself to the city. And I said to the Vice-Chancellor and the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, what we need is a procurement process that slowly turns this campus round to open itself to the city. But one way of doing that is to invite from the best young architects buildings on our campus. And I said, if you look at our campus, because this is a building that was on the campus, that is one of the foundation buildings of the university. This underneath here, also built in the 1970s, was a modernist two-story building, half a story down, half a story up. And then those in the early 70s. I said, there's no way we can be homogenous. We have to reflect the culture of the city. The city consists of a number of, the architectural culture of the city has a number of different ideas about what architecture is. And further down this street is a very famous theatre designed by Walter Burley Griffin and Marion Mahoney Griffin, who were the architects who won the competition to design Canberra, which is Australia's Ankara. Only without the ancient bit. And they built this amazing theatre down the street, and they were fascinated with the way in which the universe is made up. They were theosophists, and they were interested in the atomic structure. And the interior of this building is completely made up of little components which are repeated endlessly. So you get like an Aladdin's cave. And it's their interpretation of the atomic structure of the universe. So that's an idea about the city, a kind of early fractal idea about architecture that was alive in this street. And further down the street there are some very geometrical buildings using platonic solids and voids. And then there is just nearby here the State Library. Interestingly enough, it was the very first state library in the English-speaking world which had no entrance prohibitions. Anybody could enter, provided their hands were clean. You had to show your hands at the door. That was the only thing that stopped you. So my first opportunity to change the university's thing was, I said, oh, well, my Deputy Vice-Chancellor said, well, we can't just go inviting architects, can we? I mean, they'll just think they're your friends. So I said, well, what we'll do is we'll invite open expressions of interest to a set of criteria. Number one, demonstrated design ambition through publications, exhibitions, or any peer review of some kind. Number two, demonstrated ability to think laterally, and, well, mostly to think. And because, I mean, what architects are trained to do is to think spatially, and what we were looking for was that. I'll come back to that in a moment. And then another one, which was evidence of a capability to deal with a very difficult client, because you know universities are impossible clients. And then we said, we draw a line under that, and underneath that we need to know about your bank and about your insurance and all the rest of it. And we invite you to put in a fee bid in a closed envelope, but we don't look at that until we've selected the architect. And we also said in thinking laterally, obviously we expected you to think sustainably, but the crucial thing was we had nothing in there which required track record. We did not say, inside here is the university library, it's those floors. We did not say you have to have done a library before. I said to the Vice-Chancellor and the others, I can give you a line of architects from here to Mumbai who have done a bad library. And then you will select them because they've done a library. What we want is somebody who thinks. The Vice-Chancellor was very suspicious of me, and he put two of his oldest friends on my committee. One had run the hospital system for years, and the other was a very notable engineer. And they were both retired and both much more silver-haired than I am now. And we sat on the first selection committee and we went out. It's amazing how few people can demonstrate design ambition. So instead of boxes of people to go through, we had to sift through 30 applications. We selected 5. We gave them some money. We said, show us your design approach. We don't want a design, we want to see your design approach. And here's a limited amount of money in a very short amount of time. And then we interviewed them, and we chose this architect, Peter Corrigan and Maggie Edmond. And their building is from a very notable part of Melbourne's culture. He's a theatre designer as much as he's an architect, and his passion is for expressing the narrative of the city in architecture. This was their first big building in the city. And you can see that in here are baguette windows. His idea of scholarship in a library was to be in the library and then to be able to lean out and look down and see the town hall and see the opera house. He also used the colours of all the local football teams. Up here he had what looks like a wind vane but is not. Melbourne has a very peculiar grid. It is not north-south, it is slightly off. So that wind vane shows what true north, true south is. And the whole building sits there. This building is a very difficult building in some ways because the purpose for the building was to house the Faculty of Business. However, when the building had reached that level, the Vice-Chancellor over one Christmas bought a skyscraper in the city down here for $1 million, which was some weird deal. So he moved the Faculty of Business down there and said, well, what are we going to do here? And the architect said, we make this a school of architecture. And so suddenly it bumped up 2 more floors. And here you see in the shape of a flag, this is the architecture meeting room. The flag flying out over the street, the main street of the city. Architecture proclaiming itself. The next project we got was to redo this building, which was the university's only public meeting space. It was a 19th century building, but modelled on an 18th century meeting assembly hall. So inside a big hall at that level, with a mezzanine around it, and a basement here with other things in it. On this site were 2 small, insignificant buildings of no historic merit. But the building had been condemned for use because there was no way in which you could get into it and out of it according to the new regulations. And of course, the minute you touch a building, you have to comply with new regulations. We went through the same process. We called for expressions of interest. We selected 5. We gave them a little bit of money. We asked them to come up with a design approach. 4 of the architects tried to attach something at the back of this building. And that impacted on a lot of our other buildings which lie behind there. One of the architects said, look, these 2 buildings we've investigated, they're of no historic merit. We can knock them down and we can build a complete foyer, new circulation system, meeting rooms on the side and enter the building from the side. So we went, wow, yes, we hadn't thought of that. So we appointed them. And their other idea that emerged during the designing was one that goes straight back to the Burley Griffin building, the Capitol Theatre. And one of their bright young project architects, Paul Menifee, who's now one of our associate professors, is somebody very at home in the new mathematics, and he knew about Roger Penrose's recent invention in mathematics of non-periodic tiling. And Penrose had found if you take a tile that shape which is a kind of fat lozenge, and a tile that shape, which is a thin lozenge, you can tile any surface, moving convex and concave. The previous system for tiling in that way used more than 220 tiles. So this was a fantastic thing to insert inside this building, the building had been completely ruined in the 60s. Every single original detail had been removed. So there was no heritage thing left inside except the balcony. And the architects came up with the idea of using this tiling system to create the new acoustic ceiling with the air conditioning behind it, to clad the side walls, to make the stage. And it is quite a remarkable space. And it was very, very economical because everything in it was actually repeating these two shapes. On here it's purely decorative. This was, the university had a technical college associated with it which did brass founding, so we got them and their students to cast the tiles and they decorate the outside of this building. This was cited by Charles Jenks in one of his books as the very first building in the world to physically use the new mathematics in its manifestation. One last little story before I move on to the main part of this is that the balcony inside, the architects wanted to remove. It had some cast iron columns. And I wasn't so sure we should remove it, but we took it to Heritage, and Heritage, the argument our Heritage architect made was, this is a very poor example of one of these assembly hall mezzanine balconies. And the Heritage Committee said, this is a very good example of a very poor example. And you must keep it. And we did, and it works very well. Anyway, what this sparked in me was, I mean, we've gone on to design many buildings, and I think I'll show a few now. I'll come back to this slide and that one. But so some years later, this project was completed by adding that project on top there, which is a set of 300-seat meeting rooms which associate with those and then feed into that. So this is a whole conferencing facility. That building I've already showed you. We commissioned this very beautiful building, one of the cheapest we've ever done for printing works. This building was an education facility. Each of these by a different young architect. This is the back of that very theatrical building I was showing, and then the campus has been completely done by somebody who started working on it as a young architect, and it has won prize after prize. And this is one of our most recent buildings. It's been published in Casabella with 37 pages, which is a bit of a record. It is our design research hub. Our master's students are in here, and then our research teams in design are up here, and we run our research programs. There's a huge 8-meter tall, 7-meter wide, 30-meter long gallery here, and that is the archive, which I'm trying to link up to your archive at SALT after this. And it has this innovative facade, which this is the test piece. It now belongs to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. They bought it, which helped with the building costs. And this is our most recent building, which is a general academic building, and it sits very interesting. The civic spine comes down here, and that building frames it, and then it goes on down there. And so that's the most recent of our commissions. I'm just going to race back, because this ideogram shows our system for procuring the buildings from all of these young architects, starting with building 8, story hall, and so on, going all the way back. We've done lots of them. Design ambition, thinking laterally, sustainably, capacity for complexity, on time to budget, and so on. And then my research in this area has begun to look at, well, who else has tried to build a suite of buildings which express a culture? Who else in the world has done this? And I was fortunate to be invited by Akira Suzuki to be a commissioner for the Kumamata Art Polis, which I'll be talking about in a moment. And there is another remarkable example of the commissioning of work by young architects and local architects all based there. This fitted in very, very happily for me with the whole of my research with practitioners, because most of these practitioners have also been part of this design practice research, bringing the practice work into a critical framework, presenting it, reflecting upon it, showing what's happened to the work by reflecting on it, theorizing that so that the work can be of use to others. But I suppose right at the back of all of this, for me, is why does architecture matter? Architecture is about making sense of being in the world. As Michael Frayn says, it is the carapace of our desires. And I think nowhere in the world can you see that more clearly than here in Istanbul, where you can see people's enthusiasms and passions arising and others decaying, and building by building, almost everywhere you go. It's, I think, a matter of a sense of being in the world, but a sense of being in each city. And so I'm interested in it for that, understanding and respecting innovation in culture, in architectural culture, but particularly in local architectural cultures. So let's race back through all of this, and here I am. This is a bit what I was talking about at ITU yesterday, the research scaffold that we use to help architects to understand what's good about what they've done. And this is one of the kind of exhibitions in which one of our most notable architects, after the research, presented this piece of joinery. And he discovered, what he did is he took all his projects and he put them along a line, and those he liked he put above the line, and those he didn't he put below the line. And then he said, what have the ones above the line got in common? And he decided that what they had in common was they were all extrusions that never turned a corner. And all the ones below the line turned corners. So he thought, I'm never turning a corner again. And all of his buildings are designed in a fascinating way, like laminar flows. You just get a projection of the flow, and it floats in his mind and in his drawings, and bifurcates. And then when it fits, he just chops the ends off and glazes them. And he realized that, and this whole piece describes all of those processes of extrusion. So I looked at the Kumamata Art Polis, and there's something quite remarkable about it. And my concluding remarks, which I must make sure that I don't run over, will come back to this. But the Kumamata Art Polis came about because the governor of the prefecture of Kumamoto knew that, oh goodness, what's the architect's name? Perhaps I've written it here somewhere. The famous governor. Oh goodness. This is the trouble with being 70. Things leave you. It'll come back. But he's Itsusaki. Arata Itsusaki was a great friend of the governor, and they were very close. And the governor trusted everything that Arata Itsusaki did. And he said, look, we have a real problem in this prefecture. Everyone's leaving the countryside and coming to the main city. The villages are dying. The agriculture is no longer sustaining, and we have to do something about it. And between them, he and Arata came up with this idea of acupuncture urbanism. And Akira Suzuki did something quite remarkable, because other architects in his position say, that's wonderful, I'll do all of the work for you. He said, I'm going to do none of the work. I'm going to choose the young architects who will do it for you. And it was just a fantastic thing he did. He gave Taioita his very first public commission, which is is a fire station. He gave every significant Japanese architect since then their first commission. Sana, the principal in Sana, her name escapes me as well, but she got her first. Hasegawa got her first big project. All of these names you know. And this was partly, he didn't know these young architects. He turned to Akira Suzuki, who was editing Telescope magazine, which was a radical little architectural journal, and he said, show me the young architects. And Akira wrote them, and one by one they got a project. So you get, partly this was influenced by Alvin Biarski, because in the background of this whole thing is the Osaka Follies that Itsusaki organised and advised by Alvin Biarski. So it's quite an interesting history to all of these stories. So this is the fire station that Akira Suzuki did, and then he got another project, which was this. One of the ways in which they tried to help communities was to take their rituals and turn them into things that could be sustainable and could be sold in a way. So there was a huge parade every year, and they made a museum of the parade because every year they'd make dragons. And so this museum slowly fills up with dragons. Kazuko Fuji made this beautiful, beautiful bridge. Tadao Ando had one of his early buildings there. Hasegawa, Takasaki. I think some of these things are more successful than others. This is not a real observatory, it's some kind of fantasy of what an observatory would be. And then we looked at Malaysia, and a very difficult, I was looking at it because I knew Ken Yang very well. I studied with him at the Architectural Association, and he kept inviting me to Malaysia to look at his buildings, which are clearly innovative. But Malaysia is a very difficult political situation in which to practice. There is this political division between the races, and there is a strong desire on most people's part to occupy buildings that look as if the British had done them. So this is a country club, but every other new country club in Malaysia is mock Tudor. It's striped black timber with white panel infills. And Ken Yang's ambition he's trying to achieve a sustainable architecture. It's doubtful that he really is, but at least he's projecting a future that the elite might adopt and pursue. And it's very interesting how somebody like Hijas Kasturi has pursued the agenda of the ruling elites in this country and tried to produce an architecture which satisfied their prejudices without descending into kitsch. So I was interested in that. But more interested in that was young architects who were trying to make a practice in that place. And this is Frank Ling and Pilar Jerez Gonzalez, who met at the Architectural Association and went back. This remarkable house is based on Frank Ling's years growing up in kampongs, and it barely needs air conditioning, where it is surrounded by houses that have to be air conditioned. And their strategy for being innovative is to fill every niche in the housing market. So you go from a single family house for a young couple to houses that contain flats for the grandparents, family units, parts for other brothers and sisters, and the complexes range from the biggest to the smallest. And by doing this, they've actually managed to sustain a stream of work, all of which is genuinely not needing air conditioning, except in very extreme circumstances. So that was the kind of model that I looked at. Singapore is another place which I investigated. It's not that good a place to be an innovative architect. the story there was that in the early years after independence, there was an amazing set of opportunities for architects. Singaporean architects who had been trained overseas, they came home and they built a set of extraordinary buildings. And then the government decided we had to be international, and they stopped commissioning local architects completely. And against that grain, people like William Lim and Guan Bi continued and persisted in finding work and doing innovative work, and W architects and Woha doing extraordinary things. Both of those came through the research program that I was talking about yesterday. So did this man with this public library. And they slowly got to the point where there was a critical mass, and then suddenly the government switched, seeing what this was about. How can we actually begin to be a design centre that exports design to Asia, rather than always importing it from somewhere else? So I looked at a number of other famous examples. I'll come back to it. The Ticino, Graz in Slovenia, Belgium, and London. And I'm not sure why Scotland got in here suddenly, but this is obviously Zaha Hadid, who, believe it or not, was a student of mine many years ago. But this is Zaha at her absolute best. This little building, no money, tiny budget, incredibly clever thinking on how to create this little centre in front of this vast sub-Corbusian hospital slab. So Barcelona is obviously one of the important case studies. It has this history in innovation, which you all know about. It had that period after Franco. Well, what the engines for innovation in Barcelona were a pent-up period while Franco was losing his grip on power and eventually dying, when architects were constantly workshopping with the local community. What can we do to make things better? Beg your pardon. And things like these parks and pocket parks throughout Barcelona were all waiting to go the minute money started to flow into Barcelona after Franco had died. The community was behind them, everybody was doing them. And you all know what happened. There were things like Frank Gehry's Fish arrived, and a lot of much worse things arrived. The IM Pei building, which is a disaster, the Richard, what's his name? Meyer building, which is horrible. And I asked the local architects, what's gone wrong? I mean, you were doing so well. And in the book, I also quote Dieter Steiner on this stuff. And Ignazi Sola Morales, who was one of the chief ones, said, well, you see, our politicians said, look how well we're doing using local architects. Imagine what would happen if we got some good architects in. And I said, but you could have blocked it because they were very powerful. And he said, yes, but if we blocked them coming here, we couldn't do work anywhere else. And then I looked at the work they did elsewhere, and I said, well, you should really have stayed at home and done your work at home, because what you did in Barcelona was a hell of a lot better than what you did elsewhere. Anyway, Mendrisio, the Ticino, an extraordinary hotbed of innovation, focusing around some key characters, Mario Botto, Livio Chini, and somehow that place between sort of the edge of Switzerland, the Italian edge of Switzerland, creating the conditions for hugely interesting bodies of work. Snotsi's work. These days you would all be quoting that other architect who does big white buildings, you all know, Belgium. Belgium is a country where there are twice as many architects per head of population as there are in Netherlands to the north, twice as many, therefore, as there are in Australia or England, but not as many as there are in Italy. I've just seen that in Italy there's one architect to every 440 people. and a very thin environment and a very fractured environment between the two language groups. And you see the kind of thing that they have to do all the time. You wonder. And this is the French National Theatre, and this is the Flemish response to that. Well, not quite. The Flemish response is a massively restored old building, but this is the youth theatre part of that. A wonderful building by Martine de Marcinier. And there is this very interesting thinness in the architecture in a lot of Barcelona, in Belgium, especially in Antwerp, and a lot of it to do, I think, partly with the thinness of the economy for architects, who have to be incredibly inventive. There was a very fascinating period in Graz when a lot of that stone architecture happened, and that came about because of a conversation between the architects. And there was a Graz school of literature, and the writers challenged the architects and said, when are you going to do something for Graz which is similar to what we have done for its literature? And they came up with a lot of things of that sort, but then they began to run international competitions. So you got the Cook and Fournier Kunsthaus building, you got UN Studios Music Hall, and a collapse of that local culture because of the use of international competitions. I mean, this is a challenging thing for us, because many people think the answer to every design problem is an international competition. You just have to look at the absolutely appalling building that has gone up opposite the Mackintosh School of Art in Glasgow, designed by Stephen Hole, to see what a disaster internationalism can be. I also look at the conditions that led to Plečnik being able to do all of that extraordinary work that he did in Ljubljana. And then what the heritage of that has been, where for a country that tiny, year after year, they can mount an exhibition of 30 significant modern works by young architects. Some people say all of this is very good, but what happens in really serious cities like London, big ones? And here I found there was a man, Fred Manson. He was appointed by the Southwark Council in 1990, and they had just done a survey of their residents, and they said, what is the chief aim in your life? And 90% said to leave Southwark. And they took fright, and they appointed Fred Manson, and they started a building program and an urban design program. And this is one of the remarkable results of it. It transformed a whole derelict area. This is a library by Will Alsop with the book stacks and the reading rooms across, so that the form is not willful, it's actually quite sensible. And then another thing that happened I've just finished the story of Fred Manson. When he finished 10 years of work, of which there's just one example, there was another survey done. And they asked the people in Southwark, what is your chief aim in life? And they said, to stay in Southwark, 90%. And a good complete turnaround. So Fred Manson's work done, they sacked him. He's now running Heatherwick Studios, so life doesn't end that way. Then, of course, there's the story of London's own commissioning of its own architects, which was that fairly unusual thing of the Jubilee line. And this was done by Raymond Paolotti, who just died. He had this idea that we could use this piece of infrastructure to commission remarkable works of architecture by local architects. And if you go up and down that line, you will see every significant name in British architecture in there. In the USA, I found a very fascinating story. And it's to do with Columbus, Indiana, not Ohio. And Columbus, Indiana is the home of Cummins Diesel. And there was a massive expansion in that city in the years of the Second World War, as there was a huge demand for the engines. And there was this family who owned Cummins Diesel, and that family had always had an interest in architecture. The grandparents built a beautiful Italian-esque villa with a secret garden, sunken garden, in the 1860s. And that family carried on with this interest, and they were friendly with Saarinen the elder. And they invited him to dinner, and they said, what are we to do? The city is growing explosively, and the architecture is getting out of hand. And he had this brilliant idea. He said, look, set up a foundation and say to everybody, if you use an architect we choose, we will pay that architect's fee. And they have, this small city of 60,000 people has over 30 national monuments on its register from architects across the USA, of which this is one, and these are others. They even have a really good IMP. Harry Weiss is a not very well known but amazing architect from the Midwest. Both Saarinens did significant buildings, but every school, every hospital is part of that program. And then again in the United States you see a regeneration program in Los Angeles where a whole group of citizens for some decades now have been working on reinstating the civic spine of Los Angeles. And behind that stands a very notable figure, Richard Koszalek, and he has had a finger in all these things. Some of the things they did aren't so great, like Itsusaki's museum is not such a great building, but the latest, the building by Frank Gehry, the Disney Center, is just wonderful. It's by far and away, in my view, his best thing. All of this has been brought together in series of acts of conscious commissioning of good architects. Thomas Mann, Koenig Eisenberg, and Idor, the landscape architects. Pasadena also being regenerated under the influence of Richard Koszalek, who took over the Institute for Design, and commissioned work from a bunch of young architects, of which that's a significant piece. There's a sad story in this, like Richard Koszalek was so enamored of Gehry that he wanted Gehry to build a new library at the Design Institute, and the building that was designed for that was a kind of massive glass confection, and it cost an enormous amount of money it was going to cost an enormous amount of money. He started fundraising, and there was a revolt by the alumni. They said, this is not the sort of design that our institute is known for. We don't like this building. Either you drop the project or we sack you. And he wouldn't drop the project, so he got sacked. But anyway, maybe he was too enamored of Frank Gehry, and maybe he should have gone on commissioning work by young emerging architects in that culture. The University of Cincinnati is an extraordinary story of a state university that completely turned itself around by commissioning architects from all over the United States and bringing together in one really interesting project the successors to Charles Moore, Tom Main, Gwathmey Siegel, and in the background Bernard Toomey, and making them all work together around the pre-existing stadium to create this academic street. And they had to show each other their models and adjust and work together. An extraordinary piece of creative commissioning. I'm less impressed with what goes on in the Ivy League, although there are great buildings there. It's trophy hunting more than it is the kind of creative commissioning that interests me in Cincinnati and in Columbus. But I won't dwell on that story. We did, as a consequence of this research, we put in place a system for using these criterion-based selection processes to employ young architects across the whole of government in Western Australia, and that had a certain amount of success. This stadium was one of the results. It's been completed. It's won prizes internationally. There was a lot of innovative work on housing that came out of that program, and this state theatre was selected and built. So that was a conscious result of all of this research, and this housing was commissioned and built. All of this came out of this research, and changing the way government selected architects so that they were selecting on those criteria that I mentioned earlier. That one unfortunately did not get built. And this is another part of the story. We suggested that to sustain that, the city needed to have a much deeper understanding of the nature of its urban systems. And Beth George, one of our PhD students, did a research into that to present to the city government. My story really finishes with an interesting, I find very interesting point. People are always saying to me, what is the best system for appointing architects in order to achieve innovation sustainably? And they always think there's a system. Geoffrey London, who did some of this research with me, interviewed the mayor of Brussels, who had instituted a very good program inviting young architects to do work in his part of the city. And he said to him, "You did this when you were deputy mayor. How's it going now that you're mayor?" And the mayor looked rather sad, and he said, "Well, since my deputy took it over, it seems to have stopped." And this man here was the man who initiated the whole approach at the University of Cincinnati. And he was the one who, when he was offered the job as Dean of Architecture, he spoke to his friends in New York and said, "Should I go and be Dean of Architecture in this godforsaken city in the middle of nowhere?" And they said, "Yes, but go and say you'll be Dean on condition you can get your building designed for you by an architect of your choice." And his choice was Peter Eisenman. And it is one of Peter Eisenman's best buildings. It is a beautiful building with a sweeping internal spiral street with crick rooms all the way off it, a cafe at the bottom, a library at the top, and the whole life of the school flows up and down this kind of swirling street. And then that, having seen that work and transformed the status of that school, the president and the vice president said to him, "Well, let's keep doing this." And that led to appointing more and more people. And when they got to the point where they've reached now, he retired, the vice president retired, the president retired, and the new president came in and said, "Right, we've got enough buildings now, thank you very much. We will do something else." This man is an extraordinary part of the story. He's in Slovenia. When Slovenia was switching from being a completely communist state where everybody worked for the state to being something which allowed cooperatives, a bill was going through Parliament which allowed artists and creative workers to form cooperatives, but it excluded architects because it was argued that they were part of the building industry and they were not creative. He was a very young man, and he heard about this and he was distressed. He went to visit a family friend who was an older man who had been a judge, and he said, "What do I do? What do I do?" And the judge said, "Put on your best suit and tie, go down to Parliament and get into the committee room where they're discussing this bill." And he went down to Parliament and he argued with the beagle and he got through the first doors and then he got into the committee room and the chairman was just saying, "Are there any more questions?" And he said, "I have a question, I have a question." And they said, "Who are you?" He said, "I speak for architects." And the minister's aides were all rushing to grab him and push him out the door. And the minister said, no, let's hear him out. And he said, Minister, is the Parthenon a work of art? And the minister said, well, of course. Well, then is not architecture at least equal to art? Should not architecture... And so they pushed him out of the room, but they changed the act. So he started the first cooperative. And out of that came this new generation of work, 36 architects. But because they were a cooperative of creative workers, it was a requirement under the Act that they had to have a gallery. So they had a gallery designed by an Austrian architect, and it's a beautiful little gallery about the size of this end of the room. And in it, they host regular exhibitions which have to fit into the glass panels that are in that room. It's the DESSA gallery. However, Andrzej Chrowski is retiring, and unless they find a replacement for him, that whole little gallery might die. So the story really is, Martine de Massenet has this extraordinary ability to negotiate the political nightmare that is working in Belgium, where there are two ministers for culture, two ministers for education, two ministers for everyone, everything, because they're one for each language. And there's some huge jealousy between them, but she has managed to get a series of really significant projects through. And that's Mark Robbins, who did this extraordinary thing. He copied what I did at RMIT at Syracuse, and they began to get some wonderful buildings there. And the argument is, there's no system that really guarantees success. It really is the people and their belief in the power and the importance of architecture and their desire to help other architects to fulfill their creative potential. And one last thing, I got a phone call half a year ago from a journalist saying, are you the man who worked with all the young architects to give them their first chance? And I said, yes, I am. She said, well, who are they? So I named them. She said, they're all old architects. I said, they were young when I gave them their chance. Anyway, that's it. Thank you.
We have had the chance to spend some time since last night, but I was trying to explain how we, on a micro level of what you have been doing, what we were trying to put together at SALT. And so this is an opportunity for those who maybe don't know about the story, but basically when we had these two buildings to be restored for a new function, which was this research-based cultural center that we were describing, at one moment it occurred to be a great opportunity to meet with, first of all, a group of young architects and designers, because the idea was, it was from the beginning, it was obvious we were not going to make architecture exhibitions, I call them, I don't know if it makes sense to you, but to have a platform for more of discussions, and it was an opportunity to really commission people instead of talking about how architecture and design matters. And we ended up inviting, only from Istanbul, that was the case at that time, 19 young groups of architects, and we just sat with them, and we didn't have to go through a very formal process like you did. We were not building buildings, but we were commissioning small spaces. That was really important to us, the word space, because the spaces came with functions, and the functions were very specific for us, because we were building this research-based community, after all. And these 19 groups, we sat down together, so the first criteria of this desire for design was, I think it was just an hour or 2 hours discussion with these people that we could select the people we could work with. And so we ended up selecting 9 groups in the end, and we didn't even know which spaces we were going to commission. But I think I have to mention here Hans Mertikin for his generosity of accepting this. It was very critical at that moment, going to him, and the last year of when the buildings were already in restoration, to go to him, and it was very complicated for us because we are not the owners of the space, and we are the end users, in fact. So it was as complicated as a university. The bank was running this process, and we were just mediators in the end. so it was really great of Hunter Martin to accept these interventions and insertions. And we were able to, you can check further online if you're interested, but we were able to commission these rooms, the auditorium in this building, Salt Research, the offices, walk-in cinema in South Beyoğlu, which is closed for only 4 weeks, it will come back. So this was, on micro level, something we were trying to do on this end, and it really worked well with Salt Research, with these new products we had out of
From my
these
point of view,
discussions.
it's a perfect example of what you should do. I mean, you invite in the local community, you engage them, you give them such opportunities as you can give. And there should be a new edition of this book, and this is the sort of thing that should be in it. But I've discovered other things too since doing the book, and I mean, many of the architects I work with today come from Dublin, and many of the young architects. But the previous generation came back from London during one of the slumps when they lost their jobs, and they came back to Dublin, and they thought, what are we going to do? And they saw this area of Dublin called Temple Bar, and it was falling into terrible decline, and it was under threat from developers, and they made a whole series of schemes. That's John Toomey, Sheila O'Donnell, Yvonne and Sheila from Grafton Architects, Michael McGarry and his wife Siobhan, all of them very young, your age. They made these projects, and they also were teaching, and they had their students doing projects. And they had a journalist who joined them, and he kept taking their projects to the ministry and saying, look at this, look what we could do in this area. And slowly, one by one, they got the job to do the buildings that they did there, and they completely rescued Temple Bar, which is now one of the, well, it's a tourist hotspot, but it has some significant buildings in it. So I'm sure there are many other examples, and it shows it's not only individuals, but it's also when people get together, they can actually do these things. But your example is marvelous.
Looks like commissioning and collaboration in between architects. And now, Mary's example, one of the really good examples from our land. And I was thinking on that, your research is what we heard in ITU. It was about more the personal processes of architects, that how they are finding their ways to have different kind of attitudes. And this is more the public side of the research. And when I was trying to put them together, that you are trying to do, I guess, and we have different keywords next to each other. But I was trying to think about what we have in our around. And I was started to speak with some young architects previously. And I have heard from some of our graduates that they start to have a kind of design cooperations, a group of designers and architects trying to become and try to find out how they could have some architectural works. And I think how we can encourage, and how we can, I was thinking like that, how we can encourage, how we can be part of it. Then that is yours is one of the examples. That I don't know. Can you say something on that?
Well, my hope is that when people know and think about it in this way, you can see all the things that other people have done, and go, well, why can't we do that? I mean, there's so many different ways of doing it. But if you have the belief that architecture can help, which I think we do, and why would you study it if you didn't think that? Then rather than sitting back waiting for something to happen, you can see that there are so many examples of how something can happen. Sometimes out of desperation. I mean, the Temple Bar thing in Dublin was almost out of desperation. They had no work. They were surviving on part-time teaching, and then just expending massive energy, which you possibly can do when you're that age, and then something happens. Yeah. I think that the more one knows about the different ways in which this is done. It's just, what it also does, I hope, is counter the notion that if you want to do something, you have to import some great architect. Whereas, to me, all the good architecture comes from what you can do with what's around you.
First of all, thanks a lot for the presentation. Your sketches that you make to explain us something, they're almost architectural in a way with keywords, extruded faces. It looks as if in your process to explain something, those sketches, drawings mean something. What about your process in architectural world? Like when you design something architectural, do you do like sketches, or how does it stand? Like how does drawing stand in your way of teaching maybe, or way of explaining, or way of designing something?
These ideograms really started for me when I was a student, and I was firstly working with Richard Hamilton, the English painter, sometimes said to be the founder of pop art, and he made me do analytical drawings of a certain kind. And then when I was doing my architecture diploma at the Architectural Association, I started using these profiles. So I would draw my profile and a frame, and across the top it would say the consultant arrives and sees. So I'd be looking at myself, looking at what I was seeing, because I began to realize that what I was seeing was not what the people in there were seeing. And the first stages in my architectural career, I was using these ideograms as a way of exposing to my client what I saw, and then saying to them, what do you see? And trying to get a dialogue going in that way. As time's gone by, then much of my thesis at the Architectural Association was about this process where every observation that you make triggers a design response in your mind, and you record that and in an ideogram with all of the factors that are causing you to have that design idea, and you build up a whole series of these until you come to your final design. So that was one way in which I used to use the process. The other thing I do is to do my research, especially when writing. So these ones were all, each chapter had one of those, and that's after the research. Then you pull them together in one drawing, and when they're in one drawing and they fit one page, you know you can write a chapter. I do the same thing with a brief. If I get a brief, but I try and understand the brief, then I make an ideogram, try and get it on one page, and then that fits in that way.
I am also, I had a chance to look at your book before, and I was wondering how you were researching how architects design in many criteria, I guess, and for under the topic of innovation, and I wonder how did you collect all those architecture firms, and now I combine them with this presentation. I think so. You were all working together, but how can you maybe describe innovative? I can answer.
Well, for me, innovation is anybody who's just trying to push the boundaries of what has been done. So that I think many great innovators are very aware that they sit on top of the work of a previous generation, but they just push it a bit further. And so that what I saw when I arrived in Melbourne 27 years ago now was a bunch of young architects doing what I thought was very interesting work, and it was all right around the edges of the city. And they were having great difficulty getting anybody outside Melbourne to recognise that this work was interesting. People would look at it and say, oh, but that looks like this, so it's not interesting. But in fact, if you looked at it carefully, even though there was some resemblance to something that might have happened somewhere else, it was pushing the boundaries of what was happening there. I mean, I like to think, and I'm sure this is the case, that ideas are at large in the world. I mean, ideas are everywhere. And those ideas, they flash around the world in an instant. And then it's what people do with them in particular places that becomes interesting. Because then, in that particular culture, you make a move and that innovates in that culture. And if you look carefully enough at what's happening in Vancouver or what's happening in Melbourne or what's happening in any city, you can see people grappling with ideas that many people have, but grappling with them in a very particular way in relation to the economics, the construction systems, but also the history of the culture, its literature, its music, poetry, sport, all of that sort of stuff. So what happened in Melbourne was I saw this and I held meetings in a room like this, invited these architects, and I said, look, you owe it to yourselves and to the community of architects to actually seriously look at what you've done and explain it to yourselves and also to other architects. Because one of the reasons you can't get anyone to look at it is that you haven't worked out what your conversation is about this building, these buildings. You don't know what the story is. And you sit there cowering, thinking, I'm in the shadow of Venturi, or I am in the shadow of whoever. When in fact, you're doing something with a set of ideas which nobody else has done before. So own that, take responsibility for it, and show us what you've done. And after meeting rooms full of architects for a few months, 6 very brave people said, all right, we'll do it. and so I started bringing them together twice a year and everyone looking at everyone else's work, saying, this is what we think we're doing, and the others would say, well, maybe you're doing that, but aren't you also doing this? And so the whole group begins to unpack what each other are doing. And that's still how the system works. We now have 40 to 50 architects in Europe, 40 to 50 in Asia, and another 40 to 50 in Australasia. And the first group were invited in that way, so it's called an invitational program. We've never advertised it. People hear about it, and then they want to do it. We have a queue, but we're very fortunate to have received a €4 million grant to spread the program in Europe. So we have 6 partner institutions in Europe, and we are in the process of allocating 40 fellowships, which are research fellowships, and 2 practitioner academics who can study the practice in this process, which runs parallel to the normal one that you do. So there's fellows and there's just ordinary practitioners. And the research scaffold is something where we begin from, but people delve into many things. They delve into their history in space, like yesterday I mentioned Jo van den Berg, the Dutch Belgian architect, and his grandmother's house, and his discovering that his form making all came, he could identify all of his favourite forms from his experiences in his grandmother's house, for example. And he hadn't known that before. And I mean, he finished his PhD by writing, "You don't know what you know till you know what you know." There's so many different ways. One of the interesting things is some people say, "We know what we do. We don't need to. We know what we do. Of course, we know what we do." But the minute they join this process, they start discovering that they only know a certain amount. And when they've finished with the process, they know a lot more. And they are much more available to call upon their intuition and use it effectively, and because they're not being surprised by it and they know where it's coming from, is how some of them describe it. And many of them say their practices are transformed because they are more targeted, they understand what sort of clients to look for, what sort of jobs to look for. They're not just sitting there waiting for it.
That's the silence.
That's the hungry silence.
Thank you so much.